UCR graciously offered to host this wonderful event at its campus. And I would like to give a special thanks to President Don Cipala and Judy Kingsbury for all of the support in organizing today's event. I think without them, today's event would not be possible. So thank you, UCR and President Don Cipala. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Mrs. Sanela Ramic, our distinguished guest and author of the book Remember Me. Sanela was born in 1976 in Prijedor, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which just happened to be my hometown too. At the young age of 16, she experienced firsthand the horrors of war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And although experiencing war was the worst experience of all, it did teach her one lesson. Never plan too far into the future, for tomorrow is not promised. At age 17, as a refugee from Bosnia and Herzegovina, she was resettled to the United States. She found her new home, a place where she belongs, her beloved Chicago. In her new country, Sanela faced many obstacles. She needed to learn a new language, and new customs and rules. She was amazed at how friendly and big-hearted American people were. Their friendliness and willingness to help made it easier for her to learn. At 22 years old, she met the love of her life, her husband, Todd. They were married within a year. 2 years after they were married, they had their first son, Denny. And 5 years after that, they had another son, Devin. Sanela's life became full and busy. Ivo Andrić, the 1961 winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, who was also born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, once said, "Sometimes there comes the time when smart, good people remain silent. Fools speak, and scum get rich." Well, Sanela certainly did not want to be silent. This amazing story that we will hear about today was simmering inside Sanela's head since she moved to the United States. One day in July 2009, the story started getting out of Sanela's head and into her computer. Over the course of the next 2 years, the book, Remember Me, was completed and ultimately published June 7, 2011. Now, according to her own admission, Sanela is somewhat of a daydreamer, and she loves reading about romance, love, and mysteries. We can only hope that she will continue to daydream and write many more great books like this one. Without further ado, I present to you Sanela Ramic.
Hello everyone. Thank you for coming. How are you doing today?
Good.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come out and meet me. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Rochester Community College for having me. If you notice me looking at my notes a little more often than I should, I apologize. I just feel so overwhelmed by your presence. So thank you again for coming. Very often people ask me how it was for me to become an author. Oftentimes when they find out that I was born in Bosnia, people want to know whether I was in a war, and if so, would I share some of my experiences with them. Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about me becoming an author, which would be absolutely impossible to talk about without mentioning my life in Bosnia. And so you will hear a little bit about both experiences. Ever since I could remember, I knew exactly what I wanted to be when I grew up, a writer. I heard someone say once that in order to become a writer, you don't just learn the skill. You're born with it. It's inside you all along. It's your calling. I strongly believe this to be true. I remember the exact set of books I first read. It was Greek mythology given to me by an old neighbor. I was 7 years old at the time. I know you might say that Greek mythology is a little too complex for a 7-year-old, but to my 7-year-old mind, this was fairy tales. I loved reading about these beautiful goddesses and big, strong, wise gods. Every time I felt lonely or sad or depressed, I'd go back and read those wonderful books, and they never failed in inspiring and making me feel better. Soon after I read those, I had my library ticket and was spending most of my after-school time in a library. My parents didn't mind since they both worked, so the fact that I actually liked being in a library was kind of like a relief to them. I didn't have to stay home alone. So, pretty soon, I'm not sure when exactly, I started thinking like I'm reading a book. For example, I'm having a normal conversation with a friend or someone, and at the end of their sentence, I would think to myself something like, "She said," as she walked away. So I learned how to read people's facial expressions at a very young age, and so it was so very amusing to me. I loved being in a crowd, like a crowded bus. So I would just sit in the back and watch people's facial expressions. And then I would tell myself their stories. I'd usually make it funny. When I was 15, my whole life changed in a blink of an eye. The world I saw through my 15-year-old eyes was not pretty or innocent. You see, I was born in this small town of northern Bosnia, called Prijedor. Back then, Bosnia was a part of a much bigger country known as Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was located in Europe, just a couple of hours drive away from Italy. Nowadays, this town, Prijedor, is known for its horrible concentration camps that were run by the Serbs in 1992. I know when we hear the words concentration camps, we usually think of the World War II and Nazis. But this was not our grandparents' generation time, this was our time. In 1992, I mean, trash full of the 21st century. I remember my parents thinking and talking about how this war was going to end before it could even start. The world would not let another Nazi genocide to go on. But to our surprise, the world did let it happen. It went on for 4 years. Concentration camps, slaughtering, killing innocent women and children, raping, it all happened. During those 4 years in Bosnia, over 100,000 people were killed and over 2 million were displaced. Don't worry though, I am not here to make you feel sad or depressed in any way. As a matter of fact, I would like to tell you a short version of my own story in hopes to inspire you in some way. I know that when we talk about war, we usually think about, buildings being blown up. Maybe we even see people being blown up and killed, stuff that we usually see in the movies. But we never really stop to think about what this war actually does to an individual person. Today I'd like to tell you about one individual who lost a lot of family, the only home she ever knew, and everything else you could think of. and I'm giving you a face to the story. At the beginning of 1992, both of my parents got fired from work with no explanation at all. My parents, along with all the others who were not calling themselves Serbs in Prijedor, were fired from work. As you can imagine, little by little we ran out of food and money. And so we started going over to my grandparents' house to ask for food. My grandparents lived in this small village called Hambarine on the outskirts of Prijedor. They had a pretty large vegetable garden, a cow, some chickens, so they could survive without needing to go to the store. I absolutely loved going there. My mom was from there, so most of my family, my cousins who were also my age, lived there. And so I loved going there just to play with them. One day in March of 1992, my mother and I visited her parents in Hambarine. On that particular day, we were listening to the radio, and the Serbs were saying how they were going to shell Hambarine the next day. They said that they discovered some Muslim extremists hiding out there and that the shelling was necessary. So my mom and I tried to go back home. But were stopped by the Serb army who told us to go back. There was no way in or out of town. The next day we hid in my grandmother's basement while they shelled us. The noise outside was indescribable. However, when you're that age, 15, I guess you don't really get scared. So all you think about is all those war movies that you ever saw throughout your young life, and you know that as a hero in this particular movie, you will survive, and everything is going to be fine. I could not wait for it to be over so that I could go outside and inspect the damage, and then I'd go home and I would tell my friends all about it. However, a few hours into the shelling, we heard someone's frantic voice calling that we needed to go and run towards the woods. A column of tanks was approaching. Because Hambarine lay on the higher altitude, we were able to actually see a convoy of tanks coming for us. My 25-year-old uncle grabbed his mother, who had a stroke previous year and could not walk or move at all, put her on his back, and he started running towards the woods up the hill. We all tried to help, but there was so much confusion, and crying children, and children were getting separated from their mothers. And senior citizens were being stubborn and didn't want to go, didn't want to leave their only home. Somehow, I ended up holding my 5-year-old cousin's hand, dragging him along, pulling on his arm, trying to make him run faster. He was crying. My mother and I separated and I couldn't find her. We couldn't find my little cousin's mother either, so I knew I had to stay with him. A few of my grandparents' neighbors were Serbs. Up to this point, they lived in harmony. They helped my grandparents harvest their crops the previous summer. They were now shooting at us. Still, we managed to climb up the hill and hide somewhere deep inside the woods. They didn't know where exactly we were hiding, so the shells fell all around us. There was just so much chaos, screaming children, I cannot explain. Plus, it was really cold, it was March, and as you can imagine, just imagine being in the woods at night with nothing else on but the clothes that you had on while you were still inside. That was the coldest and the scariest night of my life. I found my mother in a group, and we decided to walk toward Ljubija, a neighboring town. Most people didn't want to leave the safety of the woods, but my mother said that it was only a matter of time until they would come looking for us. And she was right. We ended up walking to Ljubija and finding our way to my mother's cousin's house. We stayed there a few days, and then my mother met one of her old co-workers who was in the Serb army, and he helped us get home and to my father safely. Back at home, there was chaos as well. One of my neighbors decided to stop by and manipulate and harass my father. We found him laying on the floor having a heart attack. However, a few of our other neighbors, who were also Serbs, heard the whole thing and ran to my father's aid. That same night, the same guy showed up with a few of his drunk friends, trying to take my father outside at gunpoint to kill him. However, those same guardian angel neighbors stepped in and saved him once again. In the meantime, the Serbs attacked Kozarac, a town of 25,000 people, mostly Muslims. Over 2,500 civilians were killed in the 72-hour period. It was a slaughterhouse. The rest were captured and thrown into concentration camps. A few days after the Serbs shelled and destroyed my grandparents' village, Hambarine, is when the reality of how the war really is, nothing like the movies, hit us hard. Once again, the radio reassured us everything was going to be fine. They were only looking for those few extremists, and if you're not hiding them, no harm would come to you. All you had to do is put a white flag on your window or on your roof, letting them know that it was okay for them to go inside and search your home. This, of course, was a trick. The white sheet only proved that you were not a Serb, and they could now go in and kill you without a second thought. The phone call my mother received from her sister that day destroyed every bit of hope we had left. My aunt frantically told her that all of our relatives, men, were just killed in front of her, and that her own husband was taken away. She wasn't sure whether he was killed or taken to a concentration camp. My other aunt's husband, her brother and his father were taken out and killed right in front of their home. Women and children were now being piled up onto buses and trucks to be taken away to concentration and rape camps. I would now like to just take a moment and to tell you a little bit about each one of my loved ones that I lost that day. Fritz was 23 years old. He just got married the previous year. His baby boy was a few months old when the Serb army showed up and took Fritz's father and older brother outside and killed them right in front of their house. Their bodies were later moved and were never found again. Fritz's mother lost 2 sons and a husband that day. Peka, his real name was Samir. We all called him Peka because it means something like conceited. But he wasn't conceited at all, he was just shy. He had the greenest eyes. He was shy, and so that was one of the reasons he was so attractive to girls. There were 2 who loved him at the time, and I sometimes wonder which one he would have ended up with had he had a chance. Tsunchi's real name was Admir. He was so beautiful. He had the blackest hair and the whitest creamy looking skin you've ever seen. His eyes were so dark they looked black. Tsunchi was not only pretty, but smart too. At the time, he was attending college in Sarajevo, but decided to go back home for the time being to stay with his family. Tsunchi was snatched away from his mother's arms and killed right in front of her. He was 17. Mirzet was married to my cousin Leila. Just like Fritz, he had a baby boy a few months earlier. The Serb army showed up, took Mirzet and his father outside and killed them right by their house. The women, his sister and his wife were then taken to a concentration camp. Ashef was my favorite uncle of all. He had 7 daughters. One of them was my age. He was so funny and kind. Every time I went for a visit, he would make us sit down and watch Bruce Lee movies. It was funny, really, a house full of girls watching kung fu movies with him. He visited the United States of America and my beloved Chicago back when he was in college. He loved it, and he loved bragging about it. I listened to his tales of America in awe. The day Ashef was killed, he was visiting his daughter Sabina in Bišćani. The Serb army showed up, took him, his son-in-law, and his son-in-law's father outside and killed them. The women and children were taken to concentration camps. Zizka was my aunt. She had 3 children. The clearest memory I have of her is that first time I ever tasted cantaloupe was at Zizka's house. I was about 4 or 5 years at the time. My mom and I went for a visit. I don't know why I remember it so clearly. She cut it up into little squares and then she poured some sugar over it. It was the juiciest thing. The day Zizka was killed, the Serb army showed up at her door asking for money and jewelry. She gave them everything she had in the house and then she took them outside around the house and dug up the rest of it. They then took her money and shot her. The worst part about this is that her youngest son, who was about 11 at the time, was hiding in some tall corn just to the side of the house, and he saw it all. Valid was my cousin. He was so beautiful that he seemed cocky at times. He had blonde hair and blue eyes. He used to pinch my nose and call it a button, which I pretended to hate at the time, but I actually loved the attention I was getting. He was taken away from home and killed in one of the concentration camps. One day, my mother and I heard about we heard that the foreign media had heard about these concentration camps and wanted to visit. The Serbs had no other choice but to let them. However, they closed down and cleaned the worst ones like Omarska and Keraten, and they transferred some men to Ternopolje concentration camp. They tried to say that this was not a camp at all, but a place where people came willingly because they lost their homes and had no place else to go. My mother and I decided to walk to Ternopolje one day to see if we could find any of our family there. A few other women and children decided to join us on that walk, because they were looking for their loved ones as well. While passing some of the Serb houses, I felt something hard hit me underneath my right shoulder blade. I looked down, surprised to see an apple laying on the ground next to my feet. I looked up in hopes to find an apple tree full of them because by this point, I was starving. We had run out of food long ago and would just eat whatever our neighbors would give us. To my dismay, I didn't find an apple tree. What it was were angry Serb women throwing apples and sticks and rocks at us, calling us names, telling us to leave, never to come back. I got down to my knees and I started picking up those apples. My mom pulled on my arm and she started yelling at me to stand up and be proud. Don't eat their apples, but how can you be proud when you can barely stand from hunger? I didn't care about pride or anything anymore. I ate one, and I took 4 with me to the camp in case I found my uncles there. I found my Uncle Acha and my Uncle Asim there. My Uncle Acha's brother-in-law, Amir, was also there. Amir had a baby just a few days before the Serbs attacked Kozarac. He was captured and thrown into one of the worst concentration camps, Omarska, but was one of the lucky ones to be transferred to Ternopolje. When I first walked in, this was the second worst experience of my life, because the place is surrounded by wire, and then you walk in. The first thing that hits you is the smell. The toilet facilities were not working anymore, so people went wherever. But it's not the smell of human feces that hits you. It's also bloody wounds now producing pus from lack of care. All the men that were captured, that were detained in this camp, wore no shirts, no shoes or socks. So the abuse was visible on their little skinny bodies. Amir, the first person that touched my hand when he recognized me, and I was dazed. By this point, I was looking for a familiar face, only now I couldn't see any familiar faces, couldn't recognize any of them. So the first person that touched my hand was Amir. I couldn't recognize him because he looked so skinny. He was in his early 20s. His eyes were pushed in, he looked like a skeleton. He had bruises all over his body, his face. His once beautiful curly blonde hair was now covered in lice. I looked down at his hand that was holding mine, and I just couldn't believe how skinny it was. It looked like a twig. Still, he managed to give me a smile. We spent about an hour there, and then we had to leave, and they had to stay. On our way home, my mother and I decided to separate from the group to try and be less visible to those waiting to shower us with apples and sticks. A car pulled up beside us. There were a man and a woman in it, offering to give us a ride to Prijedor. They were both wearing the Yugoslav army uniform, and so we felt a little bit safer with them than we would with someone who's wearing a Serb army uniform. We sat quietly in the back of their car, swallowing all kinds of insults. Believe it or not, I cannot remember exactly what was said to us that day. My mind blocked that incident from my head successfully. All I remember is thinking how cruel and evil a woman can be. By this point, I knew how cruel men could be, but women, to me, she was all that. She looked like she was in her mid-40s. Her bleached blonde hair was reaching just below her shoulder. I'm usually not good with faces or names, but this face is so clear in my mind. I can tell you exactly how she looked. She wore red lipstick, bright red, and she was pretty, really. It's just those eyes, mirrors to the soul, and her cold words prove me otherwise. Still, we survived and got home safely. One day in August of 1992, one of my father's old co-workers stopped by, bringing my father a few cigarettes. He then told us about a convoy that was taking people, whoever wanted to leave Prijedor. They were taking them from Prijedor to Ramic safely. The convoy was to leave August 21st, 1992. We took just a change of clothing with us. He advised us not to take anything else because it would be taken away anyway. He was there to show us which truck would be the safest one for us. My father had to sit in the back with other men, and my mother and I sat, my father sat in the front of the truck, and my mother and I sat in the back with other women. The truck was so crowded that I half sat in my mother's lap. It was so hot. August. So hot, humid. And then they covered the truck with some brown tarp, and off we went. A few minutes later, they stopped the truck. An armed soldier peeked in, pointing his gun at someone, telling him to go outside and to be his helper for the day. The person that got up was Johnny. Now, think about the very first crush you ever had. It was probably someone who, in your eyes, was so perfect and handsome and smart, everything. Johnny was that to me. His grandmother lived across the street from us, and so every time he visited from Germany, we would give each other those looks. We never talked, but we knew there was something there by those shy glances. You can imagine my surprise to see him there. What was he doing here? He was supposed to be in Germany with his parents. The soldier handed him a bag and ordered he go around asking people for valuables, jewelry, money, anything. The soldier told us that he would kill Johnny if he didn't bring a full bag back. This went on the whole ride. Every few minutes, they would stop the truck and they would steal from us. At the end, I noticed that people didn't have much to give. They were putting toothbrushes and nail clippers into the bag. The soldier ordered us to lift up our shirts to make sure nobody was hiding anything there. And at that point, I wanted to die. I was 15, shy, and I would rather see Johnny see me dead than with my shirt lifted up. When he came up to where I was standing, he opened up the bag, but he closed his eyes. I had to lift up my shirt. The soldier watched the whole time. Wasn't hiding anything there. The last stop the convoy ever made before reaching our destination was on Koričanske stijene on Mount Vlašić. Armed soldiers came in, pointing their guns to every man they wanted to take out and kill. Among them was Johnny. The clearest memory I have of him now is the last look he ever gave me. As he was about to step off the truck, he turned around to look at me. The look he gave me wasn't panic or fear or sadness. It was shame. And to this day, I cannot understand why he would feel shame. He wasn't the one pointing a gun at innocent women and children. Perhaps he felt shame for the same reason I did when I had to lift up my shirt. Perhaps I'll never know. The Serb army slaughtered over 250 men that day. The rest of us were taken to the other side of the mountain and thrown onto the field of mines. And still, we survived. We slept on a gym floor of some abandoned school in Ramic for a few days. The day I was leaving Bosnia forever was August 26th. It was my 16th birthday. I moved to Croatia. I was lucky. I had family there, so I didn't have to stay in one of those refugee centers. I went back to high school right away. At school, I tried to be quiet because I figured if I seemed unfriendly or unwilling to talk, people would stop asking me questions that were just too painful to answer. One day, we were writing an essay in Croatian, and I was so happy because it was writing. This was my element. I was going to show everybody how good I was in writing. It was also my chance to prove to them that Bosnian refugees were not uneducated and barbaric. And so I wrote a long essay about a dream I had. I was very careful not to repeat the same words over and over again, and so I used synonyms. Before the war, our language was called Serbo-Croatian, and so we had a lot of synonyms. I could never separate the Serbo from Croatian. It was all the same to me. I loved it. I loved my language. I could not wait for my teacher to see, to read, and to grade my essay. I wanted to impress her so badly. A few days later, she told me to stand up. She pointed at a word that I used as a synonym to air. That word is zrak. However, I used vazduh instead. She told me this was not a Croatian but a Serbian word. And there was a whole list of words like that. And so she had to single me out and humiliate in front of everyone. Of course, I got a bad grade too. She single-handedly destroyed every bit of self-confidence that I had left. A few months later, around Christmas time, we heard that Santa Claus was going to show up at one of those refugee centers to bring presents to those poor Bosnian refugee kids. My parents ordered me not to go, but I disobeyed and went anyway with a few of my cousins. The place was crowded. Most people were just standing around with their little children up on their shoulders who were trying to get a glimpse of Santa sitting up on a stage. Instead of forming a line, Santa's helpers decided to just throw those little packages into the crowd. And the people went nuts, started pushing, screaming. My cousins and I left quickly before it broke into something horrible. The next day, it was on the news. But the news didn't show the whole thing. They only showed a clip of those barbaric Bosnian refugees who were fighting each other for a little package. This was it. This was the last straw. My parents decided then that we were never going to be refugees ever again. We were never going to ask anybody for help ever again. About a year later, I moved to the United States of America, August 10, 1993. When I first moved here, I spoke zero English. I went to Truman College and registered for some ESL classes. After about a year of that, I started credit program. I was majoring in business and management. I always had more than one English class though. My dream of becoming a writer became just that, a dream, so distant and unreachable. And even if I somehow learned enough English, I knew that I could never write happy, fun stories anymore. My mind was reset. It was filled with sadness and hatred and pain and fear. So I went to school every day. My parents started working the same month we moved here. Mom is a housekeeper at the Sheraton Hotel downtown, and my dad was working all kinds of odd jobs that nobody else wanted. The only help they accepted from the government was financial aid for my education. I was confused and needed guidance, but the adults in my life back then were even more confused than I was. I was lucky enough, though, to have met some wonderful teachers who did exactly what they were supposed to do, teach and guide. I found happiness in going to school and meeting new people. I wanted to forget everything I witnessed in Bosnia, but it was hard because more and more people were moving here, bringing with them their own memories of loss and pain. In college, I was terrified of taking same classes as the American English-speaking people. One of my professors was so strict that I hated her at times. She would make me redo my work over and over again until it was perfect. She was the hardest on me out of everyone else in her class, and I didn't find it fair. The last day in her class, she told me that her ancestors were Croatian. She was following the war on Bosnia, and it felt personal to her. She said, when she first met me, she wanted nothing more than for me to succeed. She saw the potential in me. She said, don't ever listen to what other people think or say about you. They don't know you. Deep inside, you know who you are. So hold on to that. She said, I never want to hear the words, I can't, come out of your mouth ever again. If they can, so can you. I'll never forget her. She gave me back my confidence. She helped me find my way back to me. I couldn't help but compare those two teachers. One that completely shattered me, and the other one that picked up the pieces and put me back together. I realized then how important our educators are. I also realized that there are more good people than the bad people in the world. People like those good-hearted Serbs, my neighbors, that helped me and my parents over and over again. They are the reason I still have a father. People like my English professor, or someone like Mr. Armin Budimlic and his sister Fatima. In order to forget everything that happened to me and to learn English the proper street kind of way, I started hanging out with American people. I even married one. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, those memories would come out every night in my dreams. My mom was the only one who knew about those. She was the one running to my bedroom every night and holding me like a toddler until I fell asleep again. In time, those faded a bit. My sense of humor returned, and I started thinking like I was in a book again. So I loved being in a crowd. My husband and I would sometimes go to the Six Flags with our friends, but because I'm afraid of heights, I wouldn't go on any of the rides. I know. I bore myself too. So I would sit on a bench waiting for them to get off their rides, and I would just watch people, telling myself their stories. It's perfect really because the place is always so crowded and you can watch people without being detected. One day I remember I was watching this young teenage couple goofing around and talking and pushing each other. And you can tell just by the way their body language was that they liked each other. I overheard a girl say, "No way." And then my mind started thinking, and then I kind of added to myself, "No way," she said. Turning around, she smiled ever so slightly. And she did, she smiled. But I just added it like I was writing a book. Sometimes those memories would just come out of the blue and hit me when I least expect them. For instance, I'm standing at the altar getting married, and I'm thinking to myself, I am so happy. I'm only 23. I'm getting married to the love of my life. But then a thought would escape. Fritz was only 23 when he was killed. Or I'm holding a brand new baby boy in my arms and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I love this baby so much. I would never let anybody hurt him. But then another thought would follow. Fritz's mother lost 2 sons and a husband in one day, and she couldn't protect them. And then my mind would just go back to that day and I'd